Black Myth Wukong is a grandiose combination of intense action gameplay and a creative take on one of the most iconic works of Chinese literature, Journey to the West, and its most popular character, Wukong, the Monkey King. Developed and published by Game Science, who previously worked only on mobile titles, this is their first venture into the AAA space. While not without some flaws, the game is definitely impressive in many regards, especially considering that this is the studio's first attempt at creating a work on this scale. Starting with the story, it is important to note that the game serves as a sequel to the classical novel. Though Wukong is granted Buddhahood, he ultimately rejects it in favor of living a peaceful life with his monkey tribe. This invokes the ire of the Celestial Court, which the Monkey King decides to confront. Ultimately, due to a circlet that binds him, he is defeated. Before being turned into stone, he splits his power into 6 relics and sends them to the far corners of the land. Several centuries later, we play as the Destined One, a warrior from the monkey tribe who sets out on a mission to gather the relics. It is worth noting that the game doesn't hold the player's hand when it comes to the story. The arc of the main characters should be easy to grasp, but lots of details behind the side characters, bosses, and events will be lost on someone who has never read the original novel. I personally read the book about a year ago, and still found some of the moments in the game confusing. While I don't think this is a flaw per se, after all, the old God of War games never went out of their way to bring up people to speed on Greek mythology, expecting most people in the West to have some basic knowledge on it, this might be frustrating for players who haven't read the book. My personal recommendation would be to read it. It's a classic for a reason, and there are abridged translated versions in many languages. Otherwise, if you care about the story in games and haven't read it, you might have to do your own research or read the entries in the in-game codex, which contains sometimes up to 1.5 pages of text per enemy or major boss. I will say though that the pacing of the story can be a bit jarring at times. It's told in an episodic format and sometimes doesn't give much explanation on how characters move from one location to another. But to balance this critique out, one great feature of the story is how each chapter ends in an animated music video telling a short tale. Each one is done in its own unique style, and honestly, on their own, they are simply beautiful pieces of art. But let's move on to one aspect that I believe almost anyone can appreciate: the graphics and art design. The game was developed on Unreal Engine 5 and strives for a practically photorealistic art style. It is extremely impressive when creating these detailed landscapes, from snowy mountains to lush forests and ancient Taoist and Buddhist temples. Everything just looks stunning. But the real highlight of the game, and possibly my favorite aspect, is the monster design of both basic enemies and bosses. The variety on display here is very impressive. Bears, spiders, dragons, the monkey protagonist himself, and more abstract surreal creatures fill every level. On top of that, each one is really well animated and features distinct movesets. I personally find this even more enjoyable because of how much I value unique settings and inspirations in games. Most titles in the past have taken inspiration from either European or Japanese mythologies for the simple reason that games were usually developed by people raised with these cultural backgrounds. So it's just a breath of fresh air to see something different in this case. Chinese folklore brought to life, especially with these kinds of production values. So finally, let's move on to the real meat of the title, the gameplay. There's been a lot of discussion online about whether or not this game is a Souls-like. But I believe that since we're not working with a strictly defined scientific term here, it's ultimately a semantic dispute. So I'll start by mentioning what features it has in common with the genre to bring us up to speed on some of its mechanics. We do have a stamina bar. Our main method of avoiding damage is dodge rolling. There is a limited amount of upgradable healing items that reset on rest or death. There are shrines where upon resting we also respawn enemies, and finally there are no difficulty options. On the other hand, there is no loss of currency or experience upon death. The dodge rolls also feature a perfect dodge system that slows down time for a second if we execute one at the last moment, similar to games like Nier Automata or Bayonetta. The only punishment for defeat is being set back to the last shrine. There's also none of the loot-based build variety we have in games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring. Destined One uses only one weapon, the staff, and unlocks abilities and spells throughout the game, like immobilizing enemies or Wukong's iconic ability to create multiple copies of himself for a short period. Additionally, while we don't level up in the typical RPG fashion, gaining a certain amount of experience will grant us skill points, which we can spend on expanding our combos or adding additional modifications to spells. In this regard, it reminds me more of games like God of War or Stellar Blade, which borrowed elements not just from Souls titles but also from classic character action games like Devil May Cry, taking the flashy over the top action of those games but simplifying the amount of memorization needed to execute complex attacks and combos. What distinguishes the game from both Dark Souls and God of War is the speed and flow of combat. You can really feel the character's monkey nature through how he moves and fights. His dodges are agile and animalistic, his attacks with the staff are quick yet impactful. Light attacks aren't as strong, but allow us to deliver shorter strikes that can be extended into lengthy combos. The most impactful will be the strong attacks, which we can execute through so-called focus points, either by charging a staff or delivering several light attacks beforehand. This allows us to either raise ourselves by extending the staff, swirl in the air, or poke from the side to deliver a powerful slam. Another unique aspect of the mechanics is the spirits and transformations. Transformations allow us to change into different characters with different move sets for a time, while spirits change us into a specific enemy for a much shorter time to deliver a specific special attack. The combination of all these aspects enables real fun and an engaging experience. The weaker side of the gameplay, in my opinion, which also reminds me somewhat of the modern God of War games, is something that I mentioned before: the loot system. Throughout most of the game, the progression of our armor and weapons will be very linear. We will gather resources to unlock new armaments just to see the numbers go up so we can be on par with the enemies we're fighting. The different armor sets and weapons might have some minor differences and bonuses, but ultimately I think most players will just go for the newest set, which usually increases your basic attack or defense. While later on the game allows you to upgrade weaker armor sets in particular, which gives you the choice to pick sets based on the special bonuses. Depending on how much you explore in each area, it might seem like a waste of time or resources compared to just crafting the newest sets with the highest stats. Speaking of exploration, let's talk a bit about it combined with the game's level design. I feel that in this aspect, the game is a pretty mixed bag and reveals most of its weaknesses. The game is divided into chapters, each one featuring an area separate from the others. The areas seem to work best when leading you through more striking and linear locations, but then sometimes they open up quite a bit. Combined with the naturalistic art design, I found it a bit hard to navigate through, especially in parts of, let's say, a lush forest with flat spacing throughout, which part I've already visited. The more so since the game doesn't have any map or markers. Actually, this isn't inherently a problem for me. In fact, I prefer games that avoid direct guidance as much as possible. But I feel like for this approach to work, you really need good level design and distinct looking locations, which Black Myth Wukong fails to deliver at times. The levels also often feature odd invisible walls, sometimes seemingly for no reason, which can really break a player's immersion. As for how rewarding exploration itself is, on the bright side the game does feature some pretty major secret locations, quests and bosses. These are definitely the most rewarding parts of the exploration. Not just because of the satisfying sense of discovery, but because they often lead to the most powerful upgrades, spells or items, often ones that can be specifically used against the main story boss of the given chapter. The rest of the exploration is a bit less interesting, often leading to consumable items, talismans, providing mild but not really significant bonuses or additional spirits from special fights, which usually end up being slightly stronger versions of the basic enemies. Another aspect I want to bring up is the overall difficulty of the game, which is really hard to talk about given how subjective this aspect is. Compared to other action games, it was more difficult for me than Stellar Blade, God of War or Nier Automata on their standard difficulties. And let's remember that Wukong doesn't give you any difficulty options. On the other hand, it was easier for me than games like Hollow Knight, Sekiro, Bloodborne, or Cuphead. Comparing it to Dark Souls and Elden Ring is a bit trickier, because the variety of playstyles in them is much bigger. But to give it a try, I'd say that compared to a summonless playthrough with a standard melee character in Elden Ring, Wukong is easier. But then compared to a playthrough relying on some of the best tools Elden Ring can give you, such as summons, spells, and the best skills, it will be a lot tougher since you don't really have these kinds of tools to ease the battles as much. On the technical side, playing on an RTX 4070 Ti, I was able to play in 4K resolution with a stable capped 60 FPS frame rate. The only issue I found was when I tried to apply DLSS 3 with frame generation, which resulted in weird artifacts on the screen to the point that I decided against using it. The only reason I even thought of applying it was because with ray tracing applied, my frame rate would drop below 60 FPS. Since DLSS caused these issues, I had to sacrifice either resolution or performance, which I didn't feel was a worthy trade-off. In terms of bugs, I actually don't believe I experienced any bugs or even a single crash. I'll provide more detailed information in the description under the video on my setup, just for the context. And a single playthrough did take me around 40 hours. Overall, despite some of the complaints I've presented, I think this is a very good game. What I loved the most about it was the unique setting, the enemy and boss variety, which I truly believe to be one of the most impressive I've experienced in a AAA game. The fluid and engaging combat, combined with the variety of unique transformational spells, the hidden secrets in each level, the animated cutscenes, and the creative approach in adapting a classical work of fiction. On the other hand, there is the rather basic loot system, the somewhat weaker level design, and more general exploration, invisible walls, and the odd pacing, and at times a confusing story. This game also ultimately doesn't really feel groundbreaking in any regard. There isn't really a single feature here that I could see other games taking inspiration from. But it does feature a great level of polish, and the amount of work and effort put into it is evident, especially considering that this is the first game of this level of production quality that a studio has ever made. I'll definitely be interested in seeing what they deliver next.